All right, all right. Have you resisted long enough? Is it time to learn the language of astrology? But where do you begin? Well, why not do it the fun way? Come check out the Fun Astrology 101 course and start speaking astro really fast. It's on the homepage, funastrology.com. Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller, along with Robert Glasscock. And something that I guess, as I kind of figured this out, I'm looking forward to, that I've been looking forward to for about a dozen years, is Jupiter is now in Gemini as we are recording this in late May, early June of 2024. It just has moved in there, and it will be in there until June of 2025. Now, Robert, the last time this happened was basically June of 2012 to June of 2013. And right at the end of that transit is when I got two significant prompts, and the reason that we're sitting here talking today. Not long after my mom passed in early 2013, I got a prompt to start a podcast, and I had no idea in the world what to talk about. But I followed the prompt, as I've learned to do, and it resulted in now, 4 podcasts and a bunch of episodes, and 10 years ago, and et cetera, et cetera. The second prompt was right at the end of the transit in June of 2013. I got a prompt to email this author. I was reading one of his books about narrating his audiobooks, and that turned into a 10-year relationship. So here we are again, and I guess the thing is I probably shouldn't be too anticipatory here. but what does Jupiter and Gemini bring to us?
That's fascinating because I think you mentioned to me the fact that Jupiter is in detriment in Gemini.
I know, because it's opposite Sagittarius, right? It
rules Sagittarius. So in the opposite sign, whatever the planet is, the sign opposite what sign it rules is considered detrimented. In a nutshell, Jupiter in Gemini, let's say in the birth chart, is detrimented because Jupiter naturally rules the opposite sign, Sagittarius, which is all about higher thinking, the bigger picture, philosophy, metaphysics, mass communications. Gemini is all about the details. In other words, Jupiter and Gemini in the birth chart, it doesn't mean the person will probably be very good at communications, but the tendency with Jupiter and Gemini in the birth chart is to get lost in the trees and miss the forest, get all hung up in the little things and lose out on the big picture. So the challenge with transiting Jupiter in Gemini, it says you will succeed by paying attention to the details, especially when it comes to communications, whether that's interpersonal or on the web, all of the details. So, for example, with what you and I are doing, that requires a lot of detailed work with various email programs and YouTube programs and podcast programs, on and on and on. But the idea is never lose sight of the Jupiterian principle, which is the big picture. Second of all, Sagittarius is the natural 9th house sign in the natural wheel, which starts with 0 Aries. And the 9th house and Sagittarius rule guides, spirit guides, psychic guides, the higher self, higher education, higher communication, including through religion and philosophy and colleges and universities. So the idea of your being prompted is an excellent one because Jupiter alone will carry the prompt. In Gemini, you may get a bunch of prompts, and some people will respond impulsively to those. Oh, I'm being told or prompted to do this. And oh, last night I had a dream and I was prompted to do this. And then last month I was prompted to, so they can get lost in the trees and miss the forest. Nonetheless, you should listen to those prompts and act on them. And it depends on the house in your birth chart where the Jupiter and Gemini transit falls. So in your chart, it's in the 12th.
We're going to be looking at my chart with the transits over it here as we're recording this, so check the show notes for that.
which is the most spiritual, metaphysical house of them all. So it's a terrific time for translating all of your bigger prompts into the day-to-day reality of doing podcasts and YouTube channels and books and groups and all of that. So it should be, between this June and next June, an increase in your audience, your listeners, your viewers, your students, your clients, all of that. So it's incredibly favorable for what you happen to be doing as a broadcaster, because Jupiter and Sagittarius, very specifically, and Gemini too, happen to rule that business. It also rules travel. So, and of course it rules education, which is what you do, and I do too. So for both of us, this transit tends to indicate a broadening of scope, a broadening of the audience. And it's really true for anybody. Anybody who wants to look at their birth chart and see where transiting Jupiter and Gemini falls, it is the beginning of a new 12-year cycle regarding those house matters, and also regarding the two houses in your birth chart that are ruled by Sagittarius and Pisces, because Jupiter is the old Chaldean ruler of Pisces before we discovered Neptune. So in your chart, Thomas, Gemini happens to rule your ascendant. You have a very late degree Gemini on your ascendant. The implication with the late degree is that you came into this lifetime with a fairly highly evolved communication theme, which is Gemini, a fairly highly evolved connectivity theme, connecting this idea with that idea, this person with that person, this group with that person. An idea man, a communicator. It also Jupiter rules Pisces on your 10th and Sagittarius on your 7th. So the Jupiter in Gemini brings forward partnerships of all kinds. For example, the one that you and I have, as well as your career, which is your 10th cusp with Pisces on it. All right, so Jupiter is in your 6th house, conjunct Mercury at birth, which is your psychological self-integration. It's also your work. It's also your clients. And Jupiter and Mercury in Sag of broadcasting, especially Sag of metaphysics and astrology, which is what you're doing. So this transiting Jupiter, now just entering the opposition to your natal Jupiter and Mercury, is again an aspect of expansion and growth and realization. The opposition, realization of what began at the conjunction that you have in your birth chart of Mercury and Jupiter and Sag. So this period from this June through next June is a period of realization. And when transiting Jupiter in Gemini next spring, the April, May, June period, reaches your ascendant and then begins to go into your first house, that's a culmination period of what is in the works right now, developing. And I know you've got several ideas going, one of which has to do with the radio. So you can watch how that develops over the coming 12 months as well. It's very favorable.
You know, you brought up something that I want to, now you opened a box that I have to go into. You said that the 12th house was the most metaphysical of them all. I was thinking the 9th.
It's, they go together. They're both in the natural wheel, both ruled by Jupiter. The difference being the 9th house is far more conscious and even more ego related than the 12th house. The 12th house by nature is a Piscean house, which is emotions. It has nothing to do with logic or reason or rationality. It's beyond all that. So when I say it's the most metaphysical, for example, when you die, or if you astrally project or have a near-death experience, but let's just say when you die, your soul, of course, does not. But at some point, it becomes less interesting for you to maintain the ego identity of Thomas Miller or Bob Glasscock. The body that was named that has been left behind, and the soul itself is so much larger than any one ego identity that it simply becomes less interesting to maintain it. So you outgrow it. That's Pisces. You become more and more aware of the collective nature of the soul, which is not limited to one name or one era or one family. But in Sagittarius in the 9th house, there is still, and this is the house really that does rule astral projection and so on, there is still the interest in maintaining this ego named Thomas Miller, so that you may be hurtling through space at light speed, far away from the earth. At some point, figuratively speaking, you might get so far, apparently, so far away from the earth that you really do lose your connection with the ego. That doesn't mean that you cannot come back into it, but it can. Sometimes people don't come back from those experiences. But nonetheless, that's a very consciously perceived journey, because you're still tied in the 9th house to this life and this ego. You're not in the 12th house. That's why Pisces dissolves, metaphorically speaking, dissolves everything. And it really does become pure feeling, which can range from ecstasy to terror.
Well, that's the 12th house characteristic that surprises me, because 12 years ago, when this happened the first time, Jupiter and at least the sun would have been in the same place, because it's June. So June is Gemini season. The sun would have been in the 12th. Jupiter would have been in the 12th. And I get these prompts to start stuff. You know, the 12th house, endings, completions, secret sorrows, self-undoing. How does that work out? That all of a sudden, hey, start this audiobook career that's going to last for 10 years and then continue to grow. Start this podcast, you know, it's going to be hundreds of episodes. How does that work?
It drives me crazy that people forget that in addition to the 12th house ruling secret sorrow and self-undoing, it also rules hidden treasures. The meaning being, if you're an unconscious person, the sign on the 12th, the planet that rules that sign, planets in the 12th, if you're unconscious, those signposts will point you to the ways in which you will unconsciously subvert yourself. Secret sorrow, self-undoing. If you become conscious through astrology, for example, those same planets and that same sign become your source of hidden treasure, buried treasure, and they become enormous assets. People forget this. But that 12th house absolutely rules both. This is why my big pet peeve is people no longer buy astrology books. They get everything online. The old books absolutely made this very clear, that the 12th house is both secret sorrow and self-undoing, which it is. But it is also the house of buried treasure, hidden treasure. Once you make it conscious, it works in your favor. Here's another thing. You've got Taurus on your 12th house. If you're unconscious, the sign of Taurus and the planet Venus will be your secret sorrow and self-undoing. Guess what they rule? Love and money. Once they become conscious, then it turns out that will be your secret treasure, your buried treasure, and your salvation. You have Venus in Virgo, which is an earthy sign and the sign of work and occupation. So you could have chosen an occupational path that would have undone you, and frankly, a very hypocritical occupational path. And you may have even tried to go down that path. It didn't work because there was something missing in it. And as you got into metaphysics and astrology, you became conscious of your Venus in Virgo, which happens to sextile all of your Scorpio planets. and you became conscious of your 12th house ruler, and you went in a different direction, which is frankly totally 12th house, having to do with metaphysics, spirituality, and astrology. You follow me?
Yeah, you're on a roll here, Bob. You're on a roll because the last couple of times you've read some things in here, you've almost brought me to tears right here in the booth. I mean, that hits so direct right there. And the money and love are, of course, the two areas that I've been most challenged through this path of various ways and things. So interesting on that. Now, here's a question for you. Everybody has Gemini somewhere in their chart, and we did a webinar that's on the funastrology.com website, the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus webinar, where you went through sign by sign how that aspect was going to affect people where it shows up in their chart. And you talked about it being new beginnings, kind of with a twist and a challenge, was kind of the synopsis of it. If people got that and went back now that Jupiter is in Gemini and listened to what their sign was, both for their rising sign and their sun sign, how would they apply that beginning from the webinar in Taurus with the conjunction with Uranus to where Jupiter is now for this long 1-year transit all the way through Gemini?
Well, great question. If you consider the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus to be an awakening or birth of a new value system, something, this is for everybody, around the time of that conjunction, and of course you can take an orb on either side, some new value is likely to have made its presence known. Some new interest, some new goal, some new yearning, some new desire. Now, with Jupiter of expansion and growth in the sign of connectiveness, Gemini, now is the time to implement that awareness of that new value and perhaps even monetize it, because Gemini is in a second house position to Taurus. Do you see what I mean? So with Jupiter now in Gemini, now is the time to be putting down the ideas on paper, beginning to make the connection personally, online, over the phone, have meetings, beginning to implement whatever that new value that entered your life back in April.
I could see a little bit of, everybody today, they use these terms that I don't like, but they use them. It's hack or cheat or, it's like shortcuts, basically, is what they're talking about. Here's a shortcut, is go back and get that webinar, listen to your sun and rising section, and if you already got the webinar, listen to it again, and then go roll that forward. I think that could be a neat little, you could get your own prompts just from doing that exercise. That's what I'm trying to say.
Good suggestion.
Okay, so let's leave something in our mind here that we can walk away straight away from this. Jupiter in Gemini is going to be a time of expansion. Don't worry so much about the detriment part, especially through the transit. Good things can happen, even if it's happening in the 12th house. This is a time of expansion and to grow those things that germinated during the Taurus-Jupiter conjunction, which was a big conjunction. So this is the expansion after the initial thrust. Is that a good way to kind of think about this?
Yes, and the only thing I would add to that is the idea of connections in Gemini. So get in touch with people, join groups, email people, start a business, start a newsletter, start a podcast, start a blog, start any of that Gemini connectivity, read, pursue the new value that you got interested in back in April. And it could have something to do with astrology since Uranus was involved in that. But start making the connections between this birth of this new value, a new interest of yours, and begin to implement it.
Okay, excellent. And you know what? To make it easier, folks, I will put a link directly to that webinar video in the show notes. So if you don't have that, it'll be right under the chart at the top. So if you don't have that video, you can pick it up there. And then you can go back and look at your section. I'm going to go back and re-listen to mine of Scorpio and Gemini. I want to see what he said then and what's in my heart now and follow it on through. So There's just a little bit of a glimpse of Jupiter and Gemini from Robert Glasscock. Thank you for those thoughts. And everything else we have going on here, of course, is in the show notes, including Robert's link for readings if you'd like to drill down on this. But it sounds to me like we've got some action to take over this next year. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology podcast with Robert Glasscock.